Welcome back to the Jesus Stories channel. Today's new story is The Hidden Hero Behind Esther, The Life of Mordecai Explained. Please support the channel with a like and subscribe. The content of this video has been carefully compiled from various sources, so if there are any missing details or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your additional insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story.
There are heroes in the Bible whose names are known around the world: Moses, David, Daniel. But then there is Mordecai, a man who never performed a miracle, never ruled a kingdom, and never claimed to be a prophet. Yet according to the Book of Esther, the survival of an entire nation may have depended on his choices. Why would one Jewish exile risk everything by refusing to bow before the most powerful official in the Persian Empire? Was he a courageous defender of faith, a brilliant political strategist, or a controversial figure whose actions nearly brought disaster upon his own people? To answer those questions, we must travel back more than 2,400 years into the heart of the Persian Empire, where one man's quiet act of defiance set in motion a chain of events that would change Jewish history forever. Mordecai enters the biblical story not as a king, not as a prophet, and not as a priest, but as a Jewish exile living inside the vast world of the Persian Empire. That detail is essential, because the Book of Esther is not set in Jerusalem, not around the temple, and not during the age when Israel possessed political independence. It takes place in a foreign imperial setting, where Jewish identity had to survive far from the land, institutions, and visible structures that once defined national life. According to the Book of Esther, Mordecai lived in Susa, one of the royal centers of Persia, during the reign of King Ahasuerus, a ruler commonly identified by many scholars with Xerxes I. This places the story within the world of the Achaemenid Empire, a massive political system stretching across many peoples, languages, and cultures. Mordecai was part of a Jewish community shaped by exile, displacement, adaptation, and memory. His life reminds us that many biblical stories do not unfold in moments of national strength, but in seasons when God's people are scattered, vulnerable, and politically dependent on foreign rulers. The text introduces Mordecai with a genealogy that deserves attention. He is described as the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. In the biblical world, genealogy was rarely meaningless. It connected a person to tribal identity, ancestral memory, and sometimes unresolved historical tensions. The reference to Benjamin links Mordecai to one of Israel's ancient tribes. The name Kish may also cause careful readers to remember King Saul, Israel's first king, who came from the tribe of Benjamin, and whose father was also named Kish. Scholars debate whether the author intends a direct ancestral connection or a literary echo. But either way, the detail prepares the reader to see Mordecai as more than a random man in a foreign city. He carries the memory of Israel's past into the uncertain realities of diaspora life. Yet the most striking thing about Mordecai's introduction is how ordinary he seems. He does not receive a divine calling. He does not speak with angels. He does not begin the story with obvious authority. He is simply a Jew living under imperial rule, connected to a vulnerable community, and responsible for a young relative named Esther, also called Hadassah. Esther had lost both her father and mother, and Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. This single detail reveals one of the first major dimensions of his character. Before he ever becomes a public figure, Mordecai is shown as a guardian. He accepts responsibility for someone who cannot protect herself. He becomes a father figure, a protector, and a guide. That role matters because the future queen of Persia is shaped not only by palace politics, but by the quiet influence of the man who raised her. Mordecai's significance grows gradually. and this gradual development is one of the reasons his character feels so realistic. The Book of Esther does not present him as flawless or supernatural. It presents him as observant, strategic, loyal, and deeply committed to the survival of his people. He notices what happens around him. He understands danger. He acts when action becomes necessary. Early in the narrative, while positioned at the king's gate, Mordecai uncovers a plot against the king and reports it through Esther. The conspiracy is investigated and confirmed, yet Mordecai receives no immediate reward. This episode is important because it shows his character before he gains power. He acts responsibly, even when recognition does not follow. He serves faithfully in a world where justice may be delayed and where good deeds can be forgotten in the records of empire. At the same time, Mordecai is not a simple one-dimensional hero. His decisions later in the story raise serious questions that interpreters have discussed for centuries. Why did he tell Esther not to reveal her Jewish identity? Why did he refuse to bow before Haman? Was that refusal an unavoidable act of conviction, a public stand rooted in Jewish identity, or a decision that intensified an already dangerous conflict? The Book of Esther does not always explain his motives directly, and that silence forces readers to think carefully. This is part of what makes Mordecai such a compelling figure. He lives in the gray zone where faith, politics, survival, and moral courage overlap. He must make decisions without knowing the full outcome. He must protect his people while living inside a system controlled by others. He must navigate the tension between discretion and public resistance. In that sense, Mordecai represents a type of leadership especially relevant to the diaspora setting of Esther. He does not lead from a throne. He leads from the margins. He does not command armies. He shapes events through counsel, timing, courage, and influence. His authority emerges from character before it emerges from position. By the end of the story, he will rise to extraordinary prominence within the Persian administration. But the foundation of his legacy is established much earlier, in the ordinary responsibilities and difficult choices that define him before the crisis reaches its peak. To understand Mordecai, then, we must resist two extremes. We should not reduce him to a flat heroic symbol without complexity. But we should also not dismiss the courage and wisdom the narrative clearly attributes to him. The most faithful reading sees him as a historically situated biblical character, a Jewish exile shaped by memory, responsibility, and conviction. Living in a world where the presence of God is not openly named, but where providence appears to move through human decisions, his story begins quietly, but it will soon become central to one of the most dramatic reversals in the Hebrew Bible. Mordecai's life invites us to ask how identity survives under pressure, how courage forms before public recognition, and how one person's choices can become part of a much larger story than he could have imagined. To understand the choices Mordecai would eventually make, we must first understand the world that made those choices necessary. The Book of Esther is often remembered for its dramatic characters and political intrigue, but beneath the story lies a historical reality that shaped every decision within the narrative. Mordecai was not living in the kingdom of David. He was not walking the streets of Jerusalem during the age of the prophets. He belonged to a later generation, one that inherited the consequences of national catastrophe and learned how to survive in a world fundamentally different from the one their ancestors had known. The roots of that world reach back to one of the defining tragedies in Jewish history. In 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire conquered Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and carried many inhabitants of Judah into exile. For ancient Israel, this was more than a military defeat. It was a crisis of identity, faith, and national existence. The city associated with God's covenant lay in ruins. The temple that symbolized divine presence was gone. Families were separated, traditions disrupted, and the future appeared uncertain. Yet exile did not mark the end of the Jewish people. Instead, it began a new chapter in their history, one that would reshape the way they understood community, faith, and survival. Everything changed again in 539 BC when Babylon fell to Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire. Unlike many ancient conquerors, Cyrus adopted policies that allowed displaced populations to return to their ancestral lands and restore aspects of their religious life. The biblical books of Ezra and Chronicles present this development as a significant turning point for the Jewish people. Some exiles returned to Jerusalem and began rebuilding both the city and the temple. However, not everyone went back. This detail is essential for understanding Mordecai. Modern readers sometimes imagine that the end of exile meant a complete return home. Historically, the situation was far more complex. By the Persian period, many Jewish families had already spent generations living outside Judah. They had established businesses, formed communities, learned new languages, and adapted to life within foreign societies. Returning to Jerusalem meant leaving behind stability and entering an uncertain future. As a result, large Jewish populations remained scattered throughout the Persian Empire. This scattered population became known as the diaspora, a term referring to communities living outside their ancestral homeland, while maintaining a connection to their cultural and religious identity. Mordecai belonged to this diaspora world. He was not a refugee newly displaced from Jerusalem. He was a member of a Jewish community that had learned to live within a multicultural empire while preserving its distinct heritage. This reality shaped the challenges he faced. The question was no longer how to rebuild a kingdom. The question was how to remain a people without one. The Persian Empire itself was one of the most impressive political systems of the ancient world, stretching from regions near India in the east to territories approaching the Mediterranean in the west. It governed millions of people across enormous distances. The empire included numerous ethnic groups, languages, religions, and local traditions. Unlike empires that attempted to impose complete cultural uniformity, Persian rulers generally allowed local customs to continue as long as political loyalty was maintained and taxes were paid. This policy helped create relative stability across a vast territory. It also created opportunities for minority communities to flourish economically and socially. Yet tolerance did not eliminate vulnerability. Minority populations could still become targets of suspicion, political manipulation, or prejudice when circumstances changed. This tension forms the backdrop of the entire Book of Esther. The story unfolds primarily in Susa, one of the royal capitals of the Persian Empire. Archaeological excavations conducted over the last century have uncovered significant remains of the ancient city and its palace complex. Massive columns, ceremonial halls, administrative buildings, and decorative reliefs reveal the extraordinary scale of Persian royal power. When the Book of Esther describes banquets, court officials, royal decrees, and palace ceremonies, it is describing a world supported by an immense administrative system capable of governing vast territories. Mordecai lived within the shadow of this imperial structure. He was neither a king nor a governor. He was a member of a minority community whose future could be affected by decisions made far above his social position. This environment helps explain why questions of identity became so important. Diaspora communities often face a delicate balance. Complete isolation from surrounding society is rarely possible, yet complete assimilation risks the loss of cultural distinctiveness. The challenge is learning how to participate in the wider world without losing the values and traditions that define communal identity. The Book of Esther repeatedly explores this tension. Characters move between cultures. They navigate political institutions. They adapt to imperial realities while attempting to remain connected to their Jewish heritage. Mordecai's life reflects this balancing act. He understands the Persian world because he lives within it, yet he never fully abandons the identity that connects him to his people. This historical context also explains why the themes of Esther differ from many earlier biblical narratives. The story is not about conquering a land or establishing a kingdom. It is about survival within an existing empire. The central challenge is not military invasion from outside, but the threat of disappearance from within. How can a minority community endure when it lacks political control over its own future? How can cultural identity survive when generations are born far from their ancestral homeland? These questions were not unique to Mordecai's generation. They would continue to shape Jewish history for centuries. In many ways, the Book of Esther became one of the Bible's most important reflections on life in diaspora, because it addresses concerns that countless communities would later face. By the time Mordecai appears in the narrative, the Jewish people have already demonstrated remarkable resilience. They survived conquest, exile, displacement, and cultural pressure. Yet their future remains uncertain. The empire that provides stability can also create danger. The system that allows minority communities to exist can also expose them to sudden threats. Mordecai's story unfolds within this fragile balance. Understanding that world is essential, because it reveals that the conflict to come is not simply a personal dispute between individuals. It emerges from deeper questions about identity, belonging, power, and survival. The man we met in the previous chapter is about to face challenges that will test not only his courage, but also the ability of an entire people to preserve who they are in a world that can change with a single royal decree. If Chapter 1 introduced Mordecai as a Jewish exile, and Chapter 2 placed him within the larger world of the Persian diaspora, Chapter 3 brings us to the relationship that would ultimately change the course of Jewish history. Before Mordecai became known for confronting Haman, influencing royal decisions, or helping preserve his people, he was first known for something much more personal. He became the guardian of a young orphan named Esther. This relationship lies at the heart of the Book of Esther, because it reveals not only who Esther was becoming, but also who Mordecai already was long before the crisis began. The biblical narrative introduces Esther, whose Hebrew name was Hadassah, as a young Jewish woman who had lost both her father and mother. In the ancient world, orphanhood often carried severe consequences. Without parents, children frequently depended on relatives for protection, economic support, and social stability. There were no modern institutions designed to provide long-term care. Survival often depended on family responsibility. According to the Book of Esther, Mordecai took Esther into his household and raised her as his own daughter. The text provides only a brief description of this arrangement, yet its implications are profound. Before readers ever see Mordecai confronting political power, they see him accepting responsibility for someone vulnerable. This decision becomes the first major clue to his character. It suggests loyalty, compassion, and a willingness to place the needs of others above his own convenience. At the same time, the relationship between Mordecai and Esther was about more than protection. It was also about identity. Esther was growing up in the multicultural environment of the Persian Empire, surrounded by influences very different from those that had shaped earlier generations of Israelites. Like many members of the diaspora, she lived between two worlds. She was Jewish by heritage, yet Persian society formed the backdrop of her daily life. In such an environment, cultural identity could gradually weaken over time. Language, customs, and social pressures often encouraged assimilation into the larger society. The Book of Esther strongly suggests that Mordecai played a significant role in preserving Esther's connection to her Jewish roots. He became not only a guardian of her physical well-being, but also a guardian of her communal memory and identity. This role would later prove critical when Esther found herself in a position where those very connections would matter more than ever. The narrative takes a dramatic turn when Queen Vashti is removed from her position and a search begins for a new queen. Young women from across the empire are brought into the royal selection process, and Esther is among them. From a historical perspective, this moment highlights the enormous reach of Persian royal authority. Individuals from diverse backgrounds could suddenly find themselves drawn into the orbit of imperial power. For Esther, the transition was extraordinary. A young woman from a minority community was now entering the most powerful court in the known world. For Mordecai, the situation must have presented both opportunity and uncertainty. The biblical text does not describe his emotions directly, but his actions reveal a deep concern for Esther's future. One of the most discussed aspects of this chapter involves Mordecai's instruction that Esther should not reveal her Jewish identity. The text explicitly states that Esther followed this advice. Scholars have long debated the reasons behind it. Some interpret the decision as a practical measure designed to protect Esther within an unpredictable political environment. Others view it as evidence of the complicated realities faced by diaspora communities. Individuals often navigated multiple identities depending on circumstance, balancing participation in wider society with loyalty to their ancestral heritage. Whatever the exact motivation, the instruction demonstrates an important characteristic of Mordecai. He was not merely reacting to events. He was thinking strategically. He understood that timing mattered. Information mattered. Public disclosure and public silence could both carry consequences. This ability to evaluate circumstances carefully would become one of his defining traits throughout the narrative. Another revealing detail appears after Esther enters the palace, rather than withdrawing from her life. Mordecai continues to monitor her situation. The Book of Esther notes that he regularly walked near the court where she lived in order to learn how she was doing and what was happening to her. This image provides one of the most human moments in the story. Mordecai is not presented as an ambitious figure seeking influence through Esther's position. Instead, he appears as a concerned guardian who remains invested in her welfare even after she enters a world far beyond his direct control. His persistence reflects both affection and responsibility. He does not stop caring simply because circumstances have changed. In many ways, this ongoing concern becomes one of the clearest demonstrations of his character. The relationship also reveals an important aspect of leadership that often receives less attention than public achievements. Effective leadership frequently begins in private settings long before it becomes visible in public life. Mordecai's influence over Esther was not established during the crisis with Haman. It was built through years of trust, guidance, and consistent responsibility. When the decisive moment eventually arrives, Esther listens to Mordecai, not because he possesses political authority over her, but because a foundation of trust already exists between them. This distinction is crucial. The most important influence in the story emerges not from coercion, but from relationship. The narrative provides another significant glimpse into Mordecai's character through the episode involving the assassination plot against the king. While stationed at the king's gate, Mordecai learns of a conspiracy involving two royal officials. Rather than ignoring the information or attempting to exploit it for personal advantage, he reports it through Esther. The plot is investigated and confirmed. The king's life is spared, and the event is recorded in the royal chronicles. Yet, Mordecai receives no immediate reward. This detail often surprises readers because it appears to be a forgotten subplot. In reality, it serves several important functions. It demonstrates Mordecai's loyalty to the kingdom in which he lives. It reveals his habit of paying attention to events others might overlook. It also introduces a thread that will later become crucial to the unfolding narrative. More importantly, it reinforces a pattern already visible throughout the chapter. Mordecai repeatedly acts responsibly even when recognition is absent. By the end of this stage of the story, Mordecai remains a relatively ordinary figure in the eyes of the empire. He holds no extraordinary office. He possesses no great wealth or military power. Yet beneath the surface, the foundations of his future role are already visible. He has demonstrated loyalty, strategic thinking, patience, attentiveness, and commitment to those under his care. These qualities may seem unremarkable compared to the dramatic events that will soon unfold, but they are precisely what prepare him for the crisis ahead. Long before Mordecai becomes a defender of his people, he proves himself capable of guiding one person. And in the story of Esther, that quiet responsibility will become the starting point for everything that follows. Up to this point in the story, Mordecai has appeared as a guardian, an observer, and a loyal member of the Persian world. He raises Esther, protects her interests, uncovers a conspiracy against the king, and continues to navigate life within the structures of a foreign empire. Nothing in the narrative suggests that he is seeking confrontation. Yet everything changes when a new figure rises to power. The Book of Esther introduces Haman as an official elevated above all other princes and servants of the king. With this promotion comes a royal command requiring those at the king's gate to bow and pay homage to him. Most comply without hesitation. One man does not. Mordecai refuses. The decision appears simple. Its consequences become enormous. In many ways, this moment serves as the turning point of the entire narrative, because it transforms a story about survival in exile into a story about conviction, identity, power, and resistance. The challenge for modern readers is that the Book of Esther never explicitly tells us why Mordecai refused. The text reports the action, but does not provide a direct explanation. This silence has generated centuries of interpretation and debate. Ancient Jewish commentators, Christian theologians, and modern scholars have all attempted to understand what motivated Mordecai's decision. The result is not a single universally accepted answer, but a range of possibilities that together reveal the complexity of the character and the world in which he lived. One of the oldest interpretations focuses on religious conviction. According to this view, Mordecai believed that the act demanded by Haman crossed a boundary that faithful Jews should not cross, since the Hebrew Scriptures consistently emphasize exclusive loyalty to the God of Israel. Some interpreters argue that Mordecai viewed the required homage as inappropriate or potentially idolatrous. Under this reading, his refusal becomes an act of faithfulness. It reflects a willingness to accept personal risk rather than compromise a principle he considered sacred. This interpretation has remained influential throughout Jewish and Christian tradition because it fits a broader biblical theme in which individuals refuse to surrender their convictions even when confronted by political authority. Yet the situation is more complicated than a simple conflict between worship and idolatry. The Hebrew Bible contains many examples of people bowing before kings, rulers, and respected individuals without engaging in religious worship. Abraham bows before local leaders. Nathan bows before King David. Joseph's brothers bow before him in Egypt. In the ancient Near East, bowing often functioned as a political gesture of respect rather than a religious act. For this reason, many scholars caution against assuming that Mordecai's refusal can be explained solely by concerns about idolatry. The text itself never states that Haman demanded divine honors. If religion played a role, other factors may have been involved as well. This leads to a second major interpretation, one rooted in historical memory and ethnic identity. The Book of Esther repeatedly identifies Haman as an Agagite. At first glance, the description may seem insignificant. However, readers familiar with earlier biblical history immediately recognize the name Agag in the book of 1 Samuel. Agag is the king of the Amalekites, a people remembered as long-standing enemies of Israel. According to biblical tradition, the Amalekites attacked the Israelites during their journey from Egypt and became symbols of opposition to God's people. Later, King Saul was commanded to defeat Amalek completely. Yet his failure to carry out that command became one of the defining moments of his reign. Because Mordecai is introduced as a Benjaminite, and Haman is identified as an Agagite, many scholars believe the author intentionally wants readers to see echoes of this ancient conflict. Under this interpretation, the confrontation is not merely personal. It symbolizes a much older struggle preserved in Israel's collective memory. Whether Haman was literally descended from Amalekites remains impossible to verify historically. Many scholars suspect the designation functions symbolically rather than genealogically. Nevertheless, the literary connection remains significant. The author appears to frame the encounter in a way that invites readers to view Mordecai's decision through the lens of historical identity. He is not simply responding to a powerful official. He is confronting a figure associated with a tradition of hostility toward his people. A third interpretation focuses less on theology or ancestry and more on power. Some scholars argue that the story presents Haman as a man consumed by pride and obsessed with status. His demand for public honor becomes a test of loyalty that extends beyond ordinary political respect. Under this reading, Mordecai's refusal may represent resistance to an individual whose ambitions have exceeded legitimate authority. The narrative certainly portrays Haman as someone who measures his worth through public recognition. Even after receiving extraordinary privileges, he remains dissatisfied because one man refuses to honor him. His reaction suggests a personality driven by ego rather than public service. In this context, Mordecai's refusal can be understood as a rejection of the culture of fear and flattery that often surrounds unchecked power. What makes the episode especially important is not merely the refusal itself, but the persistence behind it. The text indicates that Mordecai is questioned repeatedly by those around him. He has multiple opportunities to change course. He understands that others have noticed his behavior. He understands that the issue may eventually reach Haman, yet he remains firm. This detail reveals something essential about his character. Whatever his precise motivation, his decision is not impulsive. It is deliberate. He has considered the consequences and chosen his course of action anyway. This willingness to endure pressure without abandoning conviction becomes one of the defining traits of his leadership throughout the narrative. Ironically, the greatest danger emerges not from Mordecai's action, but from Haman's response. Had Haman reacted proportionally, the story might have ended with the punishment of a single individual. Instead, his anger expands far beyond the original offense. Upon learning that Mordecai is Jewish, Haman decides that punishing one man is insufficient. He begins planning the destruction of an entire people. This shift is critical because it reveals the deeper problem within the story. The crisis does not arise simply because someone refuses to bow. It arises because political power becomes fused with wounded pride, prejudice, and the desire for revenge. Haman transforms a personal grievance into a campaign against an entire ethnic community. The scale of his reaction exposes the dangerous consequences that can emerge when authority is exercised without restraint. Modern readers often ask whether Mordecai could have prevented the crisis by making a different choice. It is a reasonable question, and one that scholars continue to debate. Yet the Book of Esther seems less interested in providing an easy answer than in exploring the cost of conviction. Throughout history, individuals have faced moments when accommodation promised safety and resistance carried risk. Mordecai now stands at precisely such a crossroads. His decision will soon trigger the greatest crisis of his life and place every Jewish community in the empire in danger. Yet from the perspective of the narrative, this moment also reveals the depth of his character. He is no longer merely a guardian protecting Esther, or an observer watching events unfold. He has become a participant in a conflict that will test everything he believes about identity, responsibility, and courage. The refusal at the king's gate may appear small when viewed in isolation. In reality, it is the spark that ignites the entire story. What follows will determine not only Mordecai's future, but the future of his people as well. The refusal at the king's gate was never the true danger. The real danger emerged from what happened next. Throughout history, powerful individuals have often encountered criticism, resistance, or personal insults. Most conflicts remain limited to those directly involved. In the Book of Esther, however, a dispute between two men rapidly expands into a crisis threatening the existence of an entire people. This transformation marks the moment when the narrative moves beyond questions of personal conviction and enters the realm of collective survival. For Mordecai, everything changes here. The decisions that once affected only himself will now carry consequences for Jewish communities scattered across one of the largest empires of the ancient world. After learning that Mordecai refuses to bow and discovering that he is Jewish, Haman reaches a conclusion that reveals the nature of his character. The Book of Esther states that he considers it beneath him merely to punish Mordecai. Instead, he begins searching for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the empire. This reaction is one of the most important clues to understanding the story. The central problem is not simply personal offense. It is the combination of wounded pride, prejudice, and political power. Haman transforms a disagreement with one individual into a campaign directed against an entire ethnic and religious community. The scale of his response immediately elevates the conflict from a court dispute to a threat of mass destruction. To appreciate the seriousness of the situation, we must remember the geographical reality of the Persian Empire. The Book of Esther describes an empire extending across 127 provinces. Whether this figure reflects precise administrative divisions or serves as a literary expression of imperial magnitude, the message is clear. Jewish communities were dispersed across vast territories. They lived in different cities, spoke different languages, and occupied different social positions. Some were prosperous, others were likely more vulnerable. Yet, under Haman's plan, all would become targets regardless of their individual circumstances. This was not a local persecution. It was an empire-wide threat. Haman's strategy is as revealing as his motive. He does not approach the king and openly admit that he is acting out of personal resentment. Instead, he presents the issue as a matter of state concern, speaking to King Ahasuerus. He describes a people scattered throughout the empire whose customs differ from those of other groups, and whose laws allegedly place them at odds with the interests of the kingdom. Significantly, he avoids naming the Jews at first. By doing so, he reframes prejudice as political necessity. Historians have often observed similar patterns throughout history. Minority groups are frequently targeted not because they pose genuine threats, but because they can be portrayed as outsiders whose differences become convenient tools for political manipulation. Haman's argument reflects this dynamic with remarkable clarity. The king's response has generated considerable scholarly discussion. The narrative presents Ahasuerus as approving the proposal with surprisingly little investigation. He grants Haman authority to proceed and allows the necessary decrees to be issued throughout the empire. Some interpreters see this as evidence of royal indifference. Others view it as part of the literary structure of Esther, highlighting how vulnerable ordinary people become when rulers act without fully understanding the consequences of their decisions. whatever interpretation one prefers. The result is devastating. Official orders are sent throughout the empire, establishing a future date on which the Jews may be attacked and their property seized. Men, women, and children are all included within the decree. For the Jewish population, the announcement transforms uncertainty into a countdown toward disaster. For Mordecai, the decree creates a crisis unlike anything he has previously faced. Up to this point, his actions have largely involved personal responsibility and strategic judgment. He has cared for Esther, uncovered a conspiracy, and resisted Haman. Now he confronts a threat beyond his ability to solve alone. The narrative describes his reaction through traditional expressions of mourning. He tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth and ashes, and moves through the city crying out loudly and bitterly. These actions were common signs of grief in the ancient Near East, but here they carry additional significance. Mordecai understands that the decree is not merely political. It threatens the future of an entire community. Families, traditions, and generations yet unborn are suddenly placed at risk. The mourning of one man becomes a visible symbol of a much larger tragedy unfolding across the empire. The Book of Esther also presents a striking contrast during this chapter. After issuing the decree, the king and Haman sit down to drink, while the city of Susa is thrown into confusion. This image serves an important literary and moral function. Those who create the crisis remain insulated from its consequences, while ordinary people struggle to understand the danger that now hangs over their lives. The contrast highlights a recurring theme throughout history. Decisions made within centers of power often affect countless individuals who have little influence over those decisions. The story reminds readers that political actions are never merely administrative. They shape real human lives. Across the empire, Jewish communities respond with fasting, mourning, weeping, and lamentation. For the first time in the narrative, the danger becomes visible on a communal scale. The crisis is no longer confined to palace politics. It has entered homes, families, and neighborhoods. Every Jewish person now lives under the shadow of a future date marked for destruction. Yet what makes Mordecai remarkable is that grief does not become paralysis. He mourns deeply, but he does not surrender to despair. This distinction is critical. Throughout the Book of Esther, Mordecai consistently demonstrates an ability to face reality without becoming controlled by it. He acknowledges the severity of the crisis, yet he continues searching for a path forward. In this sense, the chapter becomes an important study in leadership under pressure. Effective leaders do not ignore danger, but neither do they allow danger to eliminate hope or action. As Mordecai considers the situation, one fact becomes increasingly clear. The solution cannot come from public protest. It cannot come from military strength. The Jewish community possesses neither the power nor the influence necessary to overturn the decree directly. Yet within the palace exists one person uniquely positioned to affect the outcome. Esther is no longer merely the orphan he once raised. She is now queen. For years, her rise to prominence may have seemed like an unlikely twist of fortune. Now, it appears to carry a significance no one previously understood. The crisis forces Mordecai to view her position in a completely new light. The woman he protected may become the only person capable of protecting her people. This realization prepares the way for one of the most important conversations in the entire Bible. Faced with a threat that appears impossible to overcome, Mordecai must decide whether Esther should risk everything by stepping into the center of the conflict. The answer he gives will reveal more about his faith, his understanding of responsibility, and his view of history than any action he has taken so far. The crisis has arrived, the future is uncertain, and the moment of decision is now approaching. By the end of the previous chapter, the crisis has reached its most dangerous stage. A royal decree authorizing the destruction of the Jewish people has been distributed throughout the Persian Empire. Fear spreads across distant provinces. Communities enter a period of mourning. The future appears uncertain. Yet, while many focus on the power of Haman or the authority of the king, Mordecai's attention turns elsewhere. He begins to see the crisis through the lens of a possibility that few others could recognize. Inside the royal palace sits Esther, the orphan he raised, now Queen of Persia. For years, her rise to prominence may have appeared to be an extraordinary coincidence. Now, Mordecai must ask whether it was something more. The conversation that follows becomes the emotional center of the Book of Esther, and provides the clearest window into Mordecai's understanding of responsibility, leadership, and the mysterious relationship between human action and divine purpose. When Esther first learns about Mordecai's public mourning, she does not immediately understand the reason behind it. From inside the palace, she is separated from the full reality unfolding beyond its walls. The narrative carefully highlights this distance. While the Jewish population is gripped by anxiety, Esther initially receives only fragments of information. Concerned by Mordecai's appearance, she sends clothing to replace his sackcloth. He refuses. Instead, he sends her a copy of the decree and instructs her to approach the king on behalf of her people. This exchange reveals an important reality. Esther's position may be privileged, but it has not insulated her from the crisis. The danger threatening Jewish communities throughout the empire also threatens her, whether she chooses to acknowledge it or not. Esther's response introduces the central obstacle. According to Persian court protocol, anyone who entered the king's presence without invitation risked execution unless the king extended his golden scepter as a sign of acceptance. Esther explains that she has not been summoned for 30 days. This detail matters because it reminds readers that becoming queen did not eliminate vulnerability. Royal favor could be unpredictable. Access to power remained controlled by the king. Esther understands the risk clearly. If she approaches him uninvited, she may lose her life. For perhaps the first time in the narrative, the woman once protected by Mordecai must decide whether she is willing to place herself in danger for the sake of others. It is at this moment that Mordecai speaks the words that have become the most famous statement associated with his name. Yet, to appreciate their significance, they must be understood within the tension of the moment, rather than as an isolated quotation. Mordecai begins by challenging a dangerous assumption. He warns Esther not to believe that life inside the palace will guarantee her safety. This observation is both practical and profound. In times of crisis, people often assume that status, wealth, or proximity to power will protect them from broader events. Mordecai rejects that illusion. If the decree succeeds, Esther's identity will eventually be exposed. The crisis cannot be escaped simply by remaining silent. This insight demonstrates one of Mordecai's most important qualities. He sees beyond immediate appearances. He understands that short-term security can sometimes create long-term vulnerability. He then makes one of the most intriguing statements in the entire book. He tells Esther that if she remains silent, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but she and her father's house will perish. The statement has fascinated scholars for centuries because it reveals a remarkable confidence at a moment when circumstances appear hopeless. The Book of Esther never explicitly mentions God, yet many interpreters see this verse as one of the clearest indications of faith within the narrative. Mordecai does not know how deliverance will come. He offers no specific plan and claims no prophetic revelation. Nevertheless, he refuses to believe that the destruction of his people is inevitable. His confidence suggests a worldview in which history is not controlled entirely by kings. Officials, or political systems. There remains a larger reality beyond what can be seen. This subtle confidence forms one of the theological foundations of the entire story. The climax of the conversation arrives in the form of a question rather than a declaration. Mordecai asks Esther whether she may have come to royal position for such a time as this. The wording is significant. He does not claim certainty. He does not insist that he fully understands the purposes behind every event. Instead, he frames the issue as a possibility worthy of serious consideration. This humility is often overlooked. Mordecai is not pretending to possess complete knowledge of God's plans. Rather, he is recognizing that circumstances sometimes place individuals in positions where responsibility becomes unavoidable. The question challenges Esther to reinterpret her own life. Instead of viewing her rise to queenship merely as personal fortune, she must consider whether it carries obligations beyond herself. Historians and literary scholars frequently identify this moment as the turning point of Esther's character. Until now, many of the major developments in her life have been shaped by forces outside her control. She was adopted by Mordecai. She was selected for the royal process. She became queen through circumstances largely determined by others. Here, however, she faces a decision that belongs entirely to her. She can remain passive, or she can act. Mordecai cannot make the choice for her. His role is not to command, but to illuminate the significance of the moment. This distinction reveals another important aspect of his leadership. Effective leaders do not merely provide answers. They help others recognize their responsibilities and act upon them. Esther's response demonstrates that she understands the gravity of the situation. She instructs Mordecai to gather the Jews in Susa and fast on her behalf for 3 days. She and her attendants will do the same. Only then will she approach the king. Her final statement is among the most courageous in the narrative. "If I perish, I perish." With those words, Esther accepts the possibility of sacrifice in pursuit of a greater purpose. Yet, it is important to recognize that this transformation does not occur in isolation. Mordecai's challenge serves as the catalyst. He does not remove the danger. He does not promise success. He simply helps Esther see that moments of crisis often reveal responsibilities that cannot be ignored. Beyond its immediate context, this conversation has remained influential because it addresses a universal human question. What should individuals do when circumstances place them in positions where their choices affect the lives of others? The Book of Esther offers no simplistic formula. Instead, it presents a realistic picture of uncertainty. Esther does not know the outcome. Mordecai does not know the outcome. The future remains hidden, yet action becomes necessary, despite the absence of guarantees. This is where the chapter reaches its deepest significance. Mordecai demonstrates a form of leadership rooted not in certainty, but in responsibility. He recognizes that opportunities often arrive disguised as crises, and that influence carries obligations as well as privileges. Standing outside the palace gates, unable to control what will happen next, he nevertheless understands something crucial. History is frequently shaped by ordinary people who choose to act when circumstances demand courage. The conversation ends without resolution, but everything has changed. Esther now sees her position differently. Mordecai has revealed the deeper stakes of the crisis. The moment of decision has arrived. What happens next will determine not only the fate of a queen, but the future of an entire people. The conversation between Mordecai and Esther changes the direction of the entire narrative. Esther has chosen to act. The possibility of intervention now exists. Yet, before the story moves toward its dramatic reversal, we must pause and examine one of the most unusual features of the Book of Esther itself. Among all the books of the Hebrew Bible, Esther occupies a unique place because it never explicitly mentions the name of God. There are no prophetic speeches. There are no recorded miracles. No angel appears. No divine voice speaks from heaven. No supernatural sign confirms what the characters should do next. This silence has fascinated scholars, theologians, and readers for centuries. How can a book that never directly names God become one of the Bible's most enduring testimonies about faith, providence, and survival? More importantly, for our study, what does this silence reveal about Mordecai and the kind of faith he appears to embody throughout the story? To appreciate the significance of this question, we must remember that most major biblical narratives contain visible expressions of divine activity. In Exodus, God confronts Pharaoh through signs and wonders. In the books of the prophets, divine messages are delivered openly. In Daniel, visions and miraculous deliverances shape the narrative. Esther is different. The story unfolds entirely within the ordinary mechanisms of human history. Political decisions, personal relationships, court intrigue, delayed rewards, forgotten records, and unexpected opportunities drive the plot forward. On the surface, everything appears explainable through natural events, yet many readers have sensed that something deeper is operating beneath those events. This tension between visible history and hidden purpose forms one of the central themes of the book. Mordecai stands at the center of that theme. Although he never presents himself as a religious teacher, several of his actions reveal a worldview shaped by trust in realities larger than immediate circumstances. The clearest example appears in the statement we examined in the previous chapter, when Mordecai tells Esther that relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place if she remains silent. He expresses confidence that seems difficult to explain through political calculation alone. From a purely human perspective, the situation appears bleak. Haman possesses immense influence. The king has already approved the decree. Jewish communities are scattered and vulnerable. Yet Mordecai refuses to believe that destruction is inevitable. He does not know how events will unfold, but he believes the future is not determined solely by the powers currently visible. Many scholars see this statement as one of the strongest indications of implicit faith anywhere in the narrative. What makes this especially interesting is that Mordecai never claims certainty. The Book of Esther avoids the language of prophecy. Mordecai does not announce a divine revelation. He does not predict specific outcomes. Instead, he operates within a framework of trust while acknowledging uncertainty. This distinction is important because it reflects a form of faith familiar to many people throughout history. Most individuals do not receive direct supernatural guidance when facing major decisions. They must act without complete knowledge. They must move forward without guarantees. The faith reflected in Esther is therefore not based on visible miracles, but on confidence that meaningful action remains possible even when outcomes cannot be fully known. This subtle approach may help explain why the book has resonated so strongly with generations living through difficult circumstances. Historians often note that the Jewish diaspora created unique religious challenges. Communities living far from Jerusalem lacked the political and cultural environment that had shaped earlier periods of Israel's history. Daily life unfolded within foreign societies governed by foreign rulers. Questions of identity became more complicated. Maintaining faith required new forms of resilience. The Book of Esther reflects this reality. Rather than portraying faith through dramatic religious experiences, it portrays faith through endurance, responsibility, memory, and courage. Mordecai becomes a model of this diaspora mindset. He does not withdraw from society. He participates in the world around him while remaining committed to the survival of his people. His faith expresses itself through decisions rather than declarations. Another important feature of the narrative is its treatment of coincidence. Literary scholars have long observed that Esther contains an extraordinary sequence of events that appear accidental when viewed individually. Esther happens to become queen. Mordecai happens to uncover a conspiracy. The record of his loyalty happens to remain preserved in royal archives. The king happens to experience a sleepless night at a critical moment. The chronicles happen to be read from exactly the section describing Mordecai's earlier service. None of these events require supernatural explanation. Yet, together, they create a pattern that invites reflection. The narrative repeatedly places ordinary events in positions where they produce extraordinary consequences. Many interpreters argue that this pattern is intentional. Rather than portraying God through overt miracles, the story portrays providence through the unexpected alignment of seemingly unrelated events. Mordecai's famous question to Esther reflects this perspective. Who knows whether you have come to royal position for such a time as this? Notice again the language. He does not insist that he knows. He does not claim access to hidden information. Instead, he recognizes the possibility that circumstances may possess significance beyond what is immediately visible. This balance between humility and confidence is one of the most sophisticated aspects of his character. He avoids both despair and arrogance. He neither assumes that events are meaningless nor pretends to understand everything about them. Theologically, this places Mordecai in a fascinating position. He acts responsibly without demanding certainty. For many readers, this represents one of the most mature expressions of faith found in Scripture. Another reason this chapter is important is that it helps explain why Mordecai never appears as a passive figure. Some misunderstand faith as waiting for solutions to appear without taking action. The Book of Esther presents a very different picture. Mordecai mourns when necessary. He prays and fasts alongside his community. Yet he also communicates plans, advises, and acts. His confidence in a larger purpose never becomes an excuse for inaction. Instead, it motivates responsibility. This pattern reflects a recurring principle found throughout biblical literature. Human responsibility and trust in divine providence are not presented as opposites. They operate together. People act, make choices, and accept risks while recognizing that outcomes often extend beyond their control. As the story moves toward its climax, this understanding becomes increasingly important. The deliverance of the Jewish people will not arrive through spectacular supernatural intervention. It will emerge through courage, timing, wisdom, memory, and a series of decisions made by imperfect human beings. The absence of visible miracles does not diminish the theological depth of the story. If anything, it makes the message more challenging. Esther asks whether God can be present even when his presence is not obvious. It asks whether purpose can exist within ordinary history. It asks whether faith can survive in seasons of uncertainty and silence. Mordecai's life offers a compelling answer to those questions. He lives in a world where divine activity is hidden rather than announced. Yet he continues to act as though history matters. Choices matter, and responsibility matters. In doing so, he becomes more than a character within an ancient narrative. He becomes a model for anyone seeking to live faithfully when certainty is absent and when the meaning of events can only be understood after the story has unfolded. The stage is now set for the dramatic reversal that Mordecai believed was possible. What remains to be seen is how that reversal will actually occur. Throughout the Book of Esther, one theme has quietly developed beneath every major event. Positions change. Expectations collapse. Those who appear secure become vulnerable, while those who seem powerless find themselves at the center of history. The crisis that began with Mordecai's refusal to bow and expanded into an empire-wide threat is now approaching its decisive turning point. Yet what makes the coming reversal so remarkable is that it does not arrive through military conquest, supernatural intervention, or political revolution. Instead, it unfolds through a chain of ordinary events whose significance becomes clear only when viewed together. This is the moment where the hidden patterns we explored in the previous chapter begin to emerge openly within the narrative. The fate of Haman, Esther, Mordecai, and the Jewish people is about to change, but not in the way anyone could have predicted when the decree of destruction was first announced. The process begins with Esther's decision to enter the king's presence. After the period of fasting, requested in the previous chapter, she approaches the throne despite the risk involved. The king extends the golden scepter, allowing her to live and speak. Yet Esther does not immediately reveal her request. Instead, she invites the king and Haman to a banquet. Then, she invites them to a second banquet. Modern readers sometimes find this delay surprising, but many scholars view it as one of the clearest demonstrations of Esther's wisdom. She recognizes that timing can be as important as courage. Acting boldly does not require acting hastily. Throughout the narrative, patience and discernment repeatedly prove just as important as decisive action, while Esther carefully prepares her moment. A parallel story unfolds around Haman. Convinced that his influence has never been greater, he leaves the first banquet filled with confidence. He alone has been invited to a private gathering with the king and queen. From his perspective, everything appears to be moving in his favor. Yet, the narrative immediately introduces a familiar obstacle. As Haman passes through the city, he sees Mordecai at the king's gate. Once again, Mordecai refuses to show him the honor he craves. The reaction is revealing. Despite possessing wealth, status, and political authority, Haman remains unable to enjoy any of it while one man refuses to acknowledge his importance. His obsession exposes the central weakness of his character. His identity depends entirely upon recognition from others. Power has not produced contentment. It has intensified insecurity. Encouraged by his family and advisors, Haman orders the construction of a large gallows intended for Mordecai's execution. The irony is already beginning to take shape, although Haman cannot yet see it. At the very moment he believes he is preparing the final humiliation of his enemy, he is unknowingly preparing the instrument of his own downfall. This use of irony becomes one of the defining literary features of the Book of Esther. Again and again, the story overturns expectations. Human plans produce outcomes opposite to those originally intended. The most dramatic example arrives through an event so ordinary that it would seem insignificant in almost any other story. One night, the king cannot sleep. Ancient rulers commanded armies and governed vast territories. Yet, they remained vulnerable to simple human experiences. Seeking distraction, Ahasuerus orders the royal chronicles to be read aloud. By what appears to be coincidence, and what many readers interpret as providential timing, the account selected concerns Mordecai's earlier exposure of the assassination plot. Years have passed since that event occurred. The act of loyalty had been recorded, but no reward had ever been given. Suddenly, the forgotten service returns to the center of attention. The king realizes that Mordecai has never been properly honored. This moment is crucial because it illustrates one of the recurring themes of the narrative. Actions may be forgotten temporarily, but forgotten does not always mean lost. The next morning, Haman arrives at court with a specific purpose. He intends to request permission to execute Mordecai. Before he can speak, however, the king asks him a question. What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Assuming that he himself is the intended recipient, Haman imagines the highest public recognition possible. He recommends royal robes, a royal horse, and a public proclamation throughout the city. Then comes one of the most memorable reversals in biblical literature. The king instructs Haman to carry out every detail for Mordecai. The man who wanted to destroy Mordecai must now publicly celebrate him. The official who sought recognition becomes the servant of another man's honor. In a single moment, the direction of the story begins to change. Yet the reversal is not complete. The decisive confrontation occurs during Esther's second banquet. There, Esther finally reveals both her identity and Haman's plot. For the first time, the king understands that the decree targets not only a minority population somewhere within the empire, but also his own queen. The situation is suddenly personal. Esther courageously identifies Haman as the architect of the plan. The trusted advisor who once appeared indispensable is exposed as the source of the crisis. The shift is immediate. Haman's influence evaporates. His authority no longer protects him. The very power he once wielded against others can no longer save him. The climax arrives when Haman is executed on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. The symbolism is impossible to miss. The instrument designed for destruction becomes the means of judgment against the one who created it. Ancient audiences would have immediately recognized the moral force of this reversal: pride, arrogance, and the abuse of power ultimately become self-destructive. The narrative does not present this outcome as random misfortune. It presents it as the collapse of a system built upon personal ambition and hatred. For Mordecai, the transformation is extraordinary. The man who once wore sackcloth outside the palace now receives the king's signet ring, the same symbol of authority previously entrusted to Haman. He is clothed in royal garments and elevated to a position of immense influence within the empire. Yet, the narrative carefully avoids turning this into a simple success story. Mordecai's rise is significant, not because he gains power for himself, but because that power can now be used to protect his people. His promotion serves a communal purpose. The focus remains on preservation rather than personal advancement, even after Haman's death. However, one major problem remains unresolved. The original decree still exists. Persian law does not allow royal edicts to be casually revoked. This detail prevents the story from ending too neatly and reflects the complexity of governing a vast empire. A solution must still be found. New decrees are issued, permitting Jewish communities to defend themselves against those who seek their destruction. The threat has not disappeared entirely, but the balance of power has changed dramatically. Historians and literary scholars often describe Esther as a narrative of reversal, because nearly every major element eventually changes direction. An orphan becomes queen. A forgotten guardian becomes one of the most influential figures in the empire. A celebrated official becomes a condemned criminal. A vulnerable minority gains the legal right to defend itself. Fear gives way to hope. Mourning begins to give way to celebration. For Mordecai, this chapter represents the vindication of principles that have guided him since the beginning. He chose conviction when compromise seemed easier. He chose responsibility when silence seemed safer. He challenged Esther to act when uncertainty made action difficult. None of those choices guaranteed success. Yet, together they became part of a larger story. Neither he nor Esther could fully see at the time. As the immediate crisis begins to subside, a new question emerges. How should such a deliverance be remembered? How can future generations understand what nearly happened and what was ultimately prevented? The answer to that question will become one of Mordecai's most enduring contributions, extending his influence far beyond the events of his own lifetime. The dramatic reversal described in the previous chapter solved one problem, but it created a new question. How should a people remember a moment that nearly changed their history forever? The threat had been real. The decree had been issued. Entire Jewish communities throughout the Persian Empire had faced the possibility of destruction. Yet, because of a remarkable chain of events involving Mordecai, Esther, and the royal court, that outcome never occurred. The immediate crisis was passing, but memory now became the next challenge. Human beings often move quickly from danger to normal life. Fear fades. Details disappear. Future generations inherit the results of events without fully understanding the sacrifices, risks, and decisions that made those results possible. Mordecai understood this reality. His final major contribution to the story would not involve confronting enemies or influencing kings. Instead, it would involve shaping how an entire people remembered their past. The creation of Purim transformed a historical deliverance into a lasting cultural memory, ensuring that the lessons of the crisis would survive long after the crisis itself had ended. Before examining the establishment of Purim, it is important to understand what actually happened after Haman's downfall. His execution did not automatically eliminate every danger facing the Jewish population. As discussed in the previous chapter, the original decree could not simply be erased. Persian law operated within a framework where royal edicts carried enduring authority. As a result, a second decree was issued granting Jewish communities the legal right to defend themselves against those who sought to attack them. When the appointed day arrived, the outcome differed dramatically from Haman's expectations. Rather than becoming helpless victims, Jewish communities successfully defended themselves across the empire. The threat that had once seemed unstoppable failed to achieve its objective. For the people involved, this was not merely a political victory. It was the preservation of families, traditions, and an entire communal future. The experience left a profound impression on Jewish memory, because it represented a moment when survival itself had been placed in doubt. The name Purim originates from a detail that might otherwise seem insignificant. According to the Book of Esther, Haman had cast lots, known in the text as Pur, to determine the date on which his plan would be carried out. In the ancient world, the casting of lots was often associated with decision-making, chance, or attempts to determine favorable timing. Haman believed this process would help establish the moment of Jewish destruction. Instead, the very symbol associated with his plan became permanently linked to its failure. This transformation captures one of the central themes running throughout the Book of Esther. Again and again, the story turns symbols of danger into reminders of deliverance. The name Purim itself becomes a testimony to reversal. What was intended to mark destruction now commemorates survival. What was meant to inspire fear becomes a source of remembrance and gratitude. Mordecai recognized that such an event should not remain confined to those who personally experienced it. The Book of Esther records that he sent letters throughout the Jewish communities of the empire, encouraging the annual observance of specific days dedicated to remembrance and celebration. This action reveals something important about his leadership. Throughout the narrative, Mordecai repeatedly demonstrates an ability to think beyond immediate circumstances. Earlier, he recognized the significance of Esther's position before others did. During the crisis, he focused on preserving the future of his people rather than simply protecting himself. Now, after deliverance has been achieved, he turns his attention toward future generations. His concern is no longer merely survival, it is memory. He understands that communities endure not only because they remain physically alive, but because they preserve the stories that explain who they are. In many ways, Purim became an answer to one of the greatest challenges faced by diaspora communities. Unlike populations concentrated within a single homeland, diaspora communities often live across vast geographical regions. They experience different local cultures, languages, and political environments. Over time, maintaining a shared identity can become difficult. Common memories and traditions therefore play a crucial role in preserving communal cohesion. Purim provided exactly that. Jewish communities scattered across the Persian Empire could remember the same story, commemorate the same deliverance, and pass the same narrative to future generations. The festival helped transform a dispersed population into a community, united by a shared historical memory. Scholars frequently note that collective memory plays a central role in Jewish tradition. Many of Judaism's most significant observances are connected to remembering foundational events. Passover recalls liberation from Egypt. Other commemorations preserve memories of national triumphs, losses, and acts of divine faithfulness. Purim fits naturally within this broader pattern, yet it possesses a distinctive feature. Unlike celebrations rooted primarily in the temple or in the land of Israel, Purim emerged from the experience of Jews living outside their ancestral homeland. It reflected the realities of diaspora life, where survival often depended upon navigating foreign political systems while maintaining a distinct identity. For this reason, the festival became especially meaningful for generations who faced similar circumstances in later periods of history. Another fascinating aspect of Purim is the way it preserves the entire narrative structure of Esther. The observance is not centered solely on victory. It remembers vulnerability as well as deliverance. It recalls fear alongside celebration. The story remains meaningful precisely because it does not begin with triumph. It begins with uncertainty. Communities remember not only that they survived, but also how close they came to catastrophe. This balance helps explain the enduring emotional power of the festival. The celebration gains depth because it remains connected to memory. Joy becomes meaningful when people remember what was at stake. For Mordecai personally, the establishment of Purim represents the culmination of a journey that began many chapters earlier. When we first met him, he was a guardian caring for an orphaned relative within the Persian diaspora. He possessed no obvious political authority. He could not foresee the role he would eventually play. Yet, through a series of decisions shaped by responsibility, conviction, and courage, he became one of the central figures in a story that would be remembered for centuries. His legacy now extends beyond the events themselves. By helping establish Purim, he ensures that the memory of those events will endure. The preservation of memory becomes as important as the preservation of life. Few historical figures influence future generations in such a direct way, long after the political structures of the Persian Empire disappeared, long after the names of many powerful officials faded from memory. Jewish communities continued gathering to retell the story associated with Esther and Mordecai. Yet, even as Purim secured Mordecai's place within Jewish tradition, important questions remained. Was he simply a heroic figure whose actions deserve unqualified admiration? Or does a closer examination reveal a more complicated individual whose decisions continue to generate debate? To fully understand Mordecai's legacy, we must move beyond celebration and enter the world of critical analysis, where some of the most interesting questions about his character still await examination. After following Mordecai's journey from guardian to political leader, it is tempting to place him neatly into the category of biblical hero and move directly to celebrating his legacy. The Book of Esther certainly provides many reasons for admiration. He protects Esther when she is vulnerable. He exposes a conspiracy against the king. He remains firm under pressure. He helps mobilize a response to a crisis that threatens the Jewish people. He eventually rises to a position of influence and contributes to the establishment of Purim, one of the most enduring commemorations in Jewish history. Yet, one of the strengths of the biblical narrative is that it rarely presents important figures as simple, one-dimensional characters. Unlike legendary heroes whose actions are always portrayed as unquestionably correct, Mordecai remains a figure open to interpretation. For centuries, readers have admired him. At the same time, scholars have continued to debate aspects of his decisions, motives, and legacy. Exploring these debates does not diminish his importance. Instead, it helps us understand why the character continues to generate discussion long after the events of Esther came to an end. The first major question concerns the decision that triggered the central conflict of the story. Why did Mordecai refuse to bow before Haman? And was that decision justified? As discussed earlier, the Book of Esther never explicitly explains his motivation. Some interpreters see the refusal as an act of moral courage rooted in religious conviction, historical memory, or resistance to an arrogant abuse of power. Under this reading, Mordecai becomes an example of principled leadership. He demonstrates that certain commitments should not be abandoned simply because doing so would be safer or more convenient. Others approach the issue from a different angle. They ask whether the consequences of the refusal should influence how the decision is evaluated. After all, the immediate result was a crisis that endangered Jewish communities throughout the empire. From this perspective, the question becomes whether a symbolic act of resistance justified the risks that followed. The Book of Esther does not resolve this tension. Instead, it leaves readers to wrestle with a dilemma that has appeared repeatedly throughout history. When should individuals compromise for the sake of peace? And when should they resist, even if resistance carries significant costs? Another area of discussion involves Mordecai's guidance to Esther before she became queen. The text states that he instructed her not to reveal her Jewish identity. For many traditional readers, this decision appears practical and understandable. Esther was entering an unfamiliar and politically complex environment. Caution may have offered protection, yet modern scholars often examine the issue through the lens of diaspora identity. Was concealment a wise strategy for preserving future opportunities, or did it reflect the pressures experienced by minority communities living within dominant cultures? The question remains relevant because similar tensions continue to exist today. Individuals and communities frequently navigate the balance between maintaining distinct identities and adapting to the societies in which they live. Mordecai's advice, therefore, invites broader reflection about assimilation, cultural preservation, and the costs associated with each choice. A third debate emerges from the closing chapters of Esther. Following the reversal of fortune, Jewish communities receive legal authorization to defend themselves against those who seek their destruction. The narrative records significant violence during these conflicts. Traditional interpretations generally view these events as acts of self-defense, carried out in response to a genuine existential threat. According to this understanding, the Jewish communities acted within the legal framework established by the Second Decree, and sought to preserve their lives against hostile forces. Nevertheless, some modern readers find aspects of the narrative challenging. They ask how contemporary audiences should interpret passages involving large-scale conflict and loss of life. These questions are not unique to Esther. Similar discussions occur throughout the study of ancient history and biblical literature. The issue often involves understanding historical events within their original context, while also recognizing that modern ethical frameworks may raise additional questions. The presence of such debates demonstrates the complexity of the text rather than any failure within it. Mordecai's rise to political authority has also generated differing interpretations. On one level, his promotion appears entirely deserved. He has demonstrated loyalty, wisdom, and courage. The narrative presents his elevation as a reversal of injustice and a recognition of previously overlooked service, yet some scholars note an interesting tension. Mordecai ultimately becomes part of the same imperial system that earlier threatened his people. He does not overthrow the structures of Persian power. Instead, he learns how to operate effectively within them. This observation has led to broader discussions about leadership and political engagement. Is meaningful change best achieved through opposition to existing systems, or through participation in them? The Book of Esther does not offer a universal answer, but Mordecai's story suggests that influence sometimes emerges through strategic engagement rather than separation. The literary design of Esther contributes further to these debates because the narrator rarely provides direct moral evaluations of Mordecai's decisions. In many biblical books, characters receive explicit praise or criticism. Esther is more restrained. Readers observe actions and outcomes, but they are often left to draw their own conclusions regarding motivation and morality. This narrative approach is one reason the book has remained so fascinating to scholars. The absence of constant authorial judgment creates space for interpretation. Different communities, traditions, and academic perspectives can emphasize different aspects of Mordecai's character while remaining grounded in the same text. Some readers focus on courage, others focus on strategy. Some emphasize faithfulness, others examine ambiguity and complexity. The character remains compelling precisely because he resists simplistic categorization. Perhaps the most important observation is that these debates reveal the realism of the Book of Esther. Mordecai operates in a world where choices rarely present themselves as obvious distinctions between perfect good and obvious evil. He must make decisions with incomplete information. He faces competing responsibilities. He cannot predict every consequence of his actions. In this respect, he resembles many historical leaders more than idealized literary heroes. Real leadership often involves uncertainty, risk, and outcomes that cannot be fully controlled. The narrative does not portray Mordecai as infallible. Instead, it portrays him as a person navigating extraordinary circumstances with the resources available to him. This realism helps explain why readers continue to find the story relevant. Human beings still confront questions about identity, responsibility, compromise, courage, and power. The circumstances may differ, but the underlying challenges remain familiar. By this stage in our journey, one conclusion becomes increasingly clear. Whether viewed primarily as a hero, a strategist, a survivor, or a complex historical figure, Mordecai cannot be dismissed as a minor character. His influence shapes every major development within the narrative. His decisions continue to provoke discussion. His legacy extends beyond the events themselves into the broader conversations that those events continue to inspire. Yet, before we can fully assess that legacy, one final area of investigation remains. How much of the story can be connected to the historical world beyond the biblical text? What evidence exists for the people, places, and events associated with Esther and Mordecai? To answer those questions, we must leave the realm of character analysis and enter the fascinating field of historical inquiry, where the relationship between scripture, archaeology, and ancient history becomes the focus of our attention. Throughout this documentary, we have followed Mordecai through the world presented by the Book of Esther. We have examined his role as guardian, strategist, political actor, and defender of his people. We have explored themes of identity, leadership, faith, and survival. Yet, an important question remains. How does this story relate to the historical world beyond the biblical text? Did Mordecai actually exist? Can Esther, Haman, or the events described in the narrative be confirmed through independent evidence? These questions move us from literary and theological analysis into the field of historical investigation. Unlike theological interpretation, which explores meaning and significance, historical research focuses on evidence, context, probability, and verification. The goal is not to prove or disprove faith, but to understand what can reasonably be known about the world in which the story is set. As with many ancient texts, the answers are both fascinating and complex. The strongest historical foundation of the Book of Esther lies in its broader setting. Most scholars identify King Ahasuerus with Xerxes I, the Persian ruler who governed the Achaemenid Empire during the 5th century BC. This identification is supported by linguistic evidence, connecting the Hebrew name Ahasuerus to the Old Persian royal name commonly associated with Xerxes, while absolute certainty is impossible. The majority scholarly view considers this connection plausible and historically credible. If this identification is correct, the narrative unfolds during one of the most powerful periods in Persian history. The empire stretched across vast territories and governed numerous peoples, languages, and cultures. Such an environment corresponds closely to the world described in Esther, where royal decrees travel across immense distances and decisions made within the palace affect communities throughout the empire. Archaeology provides additional support for the historical backdrop of the narrative. The city of Susa, where much of the story takes place, is not a legendary location, but a well-documented administrative and royal center of the Persian Empire. Excavations conducted over many decades have uncovered palace complexes, ceremonial halls, administrative buildings, inscriptions, and architectural remains that reveal the scale and sophistication of Persian rule. When readers encounter descriptions of royal banquets, court officials, palace gates, and imperial administration in Esther, they are encountering details that fit comfortably within what historians know about Persian society. Archaeology cannot verify every event recorded in the book, but it does confirm that the setting itself belongs to a recognizable historical world rather than a purely fictional one. The situation becomes more complicated when attention shifts from the setting to the individual characters. Despite extensive research, historians have not discovered direct external evidence confirming the existence of Mordecai as described in the Book of Esther. No surviving Persian inscription identifies a Jewish official by that exact role and biography. Likewise, there is no independent Persian record explicitly confirming Esther as queen. For some scholars, this absence encourages caution. Ancient empires produced enormous quantities of records, and historians naturally prefer contemporary documentation when reconstructing past events. However, other researchers point out that such expectations can sometimes be unrealistic. The overwhelming majority of individuals who lived in the ancient world left no surviving records at all. Even many influential officials are known only through fragmentary evidence. The absence of direct confirmation does not necessarily mean a person never existed. It simply means the available evidence remains incomplete. One particularly interesting discussion involves references found in certain Persian administrative texts to individuals bearing names similar to Mordecai. Scholars continue to debate whether any of these references can be connected to the biblical figure. At present, no consensus exists. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. Nevertheless, such findings demonstrate that names resembling Mordecai were known within the Persian world. This does not prove the biblical narrative, but it reinforces the plausibility of its cultural setting. Historians often work within this space between certainty and possibility. Not every question can be answered definitively, yet some explanations remain more probable than others based on available evidence. Another major area of scholarly debate concerns the literary nature of the Book of Esther itself. Some scholars regard it primarily as a historical narrative, rooted in actual events. Others describe it as a historical novella, a literary work that uses real historical settings while shaping the story to communicate larger themes about identity, survival, and providence. This distinction is important because ancient writers did not always approach history in the same way modern historians do. Ancient narratives frequently combined factual memories, communal traditions, literary artistry, and theological reflection. As a result, The question is not always whether a text is entirely historical or entirely fictional. More often, scholars ask how historical memory and literary construction interact within a particular work. Esther remains one of the most discussed examples of this issue in biblical studies. The character of Haman illustrates these challenges particularly well. The narrative identifies him as an Agagite, a term that has generated extensive scholarly discussion. Some interpreters see the designation as a symbolic connection to Israel's ancient enemies, particularly the Amalekites. Others suggest it may preserve historical traditions that are no longer fully understood. Because independent evidence remains limited, historians cannot determine the issue with complete confidence. This uncertainty highlights an important principle of responsible scholarship. Good historians distinguish carefully between what is known, what is probable, and what remains uncertain. The Book of Esther contains elements that can be connected to historical realities, but it also contains questions that current evidence cannot fully resolve. Interestingly, even scholars who disagree about specific historical details often acknowledge the narrative's impressive familiarity with Persian customs and administration. Court procedures, royal banquets, systems of communication, legal practices, and aspects of palace life frequently correspond with what is known from other sources about the Achaemenid Empire. This does not automatically verify every event within the story, but it suggests that the author possessed substantial knowledge of Persian culture, or had access to traditions preserving such knowledge. The result is a narrative that feels deeply rooted in a genuine historical environment, even where direct verification remains elusive. Yet, perhaps the most revealing question is not whether every detail can be independently confirmed. The more interesting question may be why the story survived for so long and became so influential. Ancient literature disappears constantly. Countless texts have been lost. The Book of Esther endured because generations found something valuable within it. It spoke to communities living as minorities. It addressed questions of identity under foreign rule. It explored leadership during crisis and courage under pressure. It offered a framework for understanding survival in uncertain times. Whether approached from a religious, historical, or literary perspective, the narrative possessed remarkable staying power. This fact alone deserves attention. Historical influence is itself a form of evidence. By this stage, a balanced conclusion begins to emerge. The Persian setting of Esther aligns well with what historians know about the ancient world. The city of Susa, the structures of imperial administration, and the broader political environment possess strong historical credibility. At the same time, direct external evidence for Mordecai and several other central figures remains limited. Responsible scholarship, therefore, avoids both extremes. It neither dismisses the narrative as pure fiction, nor claims more certainty than the evidence allows. Instead, it recognizes a story situated at the intersection of history, memory, theology, and literature. Mordecai stands precisely at that intersection. He is simultaneously a biblical character, a historical possibility, a literary figure, and a symbol whose influence has extended far beyond the era in which the narrative is set. Yet, after examining the evidence, one final question still remains. Why has Mordecai continued to matter for more than 2,000 years? Why does a Jewish exile from the Persian period continue to attract attention from historians, theologians, and readers today? To answer that question, we must turn to the final chapter and examine the lasting legacy of the man whose story has survived long after the empire around him disappeared. As we reach the end of Mordecai's story, it becomes clear that his significance cannot be measured solely by the events recorded in the Book of Esther. The crisis with Haman ended. The decrees of the Persian Empire passed into history. The political world that once seemed so powerful eventually disappeared. Yet the memory of Mordecai endured. This alone makes him an unusual figure. Countless officials, nobles, and rulers who possessed far greater authority during their lifetimes have been largely forgotten. Mordecai, by contrast, remained part of Jewish memory, religious tradition, and scholarly discussion for more than 2 millennia. His lasting influence invites a final question. Why has this particular individual continued to matter for so long? The answer lies not in a single achievement, but in the unique combination of themes his story represents. Through Mordecai, the Book of Esther explores questions of identity, responsibility, leadership, memory, and survival that continue to resonate far beyond the world of ancient Persia. One of the most important aspects of Mordecai's legacy is his connection to the survival of Jewish identity during the diaspora period. Throughout this documentary, we have seen that the central challenge facing Mordecai was not the restoration of a kingdom or the conquest of territory. His world was different. The Jewish people lived within a foreign empire, scattered across distant regions and surrounded by larger cultures. Under such circumstances, survival required more than physical protection. It required the preservation of communal identity. Communities can disappear without being conquered if they gradually lose the traditions, memories, and values that define them. Mordecai understood this reality. His actions consistently reflect concern for the future of his people rather than for personal advancement. Whether raising Esther, responding to the crisis created by Haman, or helping establish Purim, he repeatedly acts with the larger community in mind. In this sense, his legacy extends beyond the rescue of a single generation. He becomes part of the broader effort to ensure that Jewish identity remains intact despite the pressures of exile and dispersion. Mordecai also offers an important model of leadership. Modern discussions of leadership often emphasize visibility, authority, and public influence. The Book of Esther presents a different perspective. For much of the story, Mordecai operates behind the scenes. His influence emerges through guidance, judgment, and the ability to recognize the significance of events before others do. He never begins the narrative as a ruler. He possesses no army and commands no political institution, yet he understands people, timing, and responsibility. Perhaps most importantly, he recognizes potential in others. His relationship with Esther demonstrates this clearly. He does not become the central public figure during the decisive moment of the crisis. Instead, he helps Esther recognize her own responsibility and prepares her to act. This aspect of his leadership remains relevant because it challenges the assumption that influence depends entirely on formal power. Some of the most significant leaders in history have shaped events not through domination, but through mentorship, guidance, and the ability to inspire courage in others. Another reason Mordecai's legacy remains compelling is that his story speaks directly to the experience of uncertainty. Many biblical figures operate within narratives marked by dramatic miracles or explicit divine intervention. Esther is different. The story unfolds through ordinary events, political decisions, personal risks, and human choices. Mordecai never receives a prophetic vision. He never performs a miracle. He never gains access to complete knowledge of the future. Yet he continues to act responsibly despite uncertainty. This feature of the narrative may help explain why so many readers across different generations have found his story meaningful. Most people live their lives without certainty about outcomes. They make decisions with incomplete information. They face situations where courage is required, even though success is not guaranteed. Mordecai embodies that reality. His example suggests that responsible action does not depend upon possessing perfect knowledge. It depends upon recognizing one's obligations and acting faithfully within the limits of what can be known. The establishment of Purim provides another important dimension of his legacy. Historical events often fade from memory within a few generations. Mordecai understood that survival alone was not enough. The story needed to be remembered. By helping transform a historical crisis into an annual act of communal remembrance, he contributed to the preservation of collective memory. This achievement should not be underestimated. Communities are shaped by the stories they choose to remember. Through Purim, future generations would continue reflecting on themes of vulnerability, courage, deliverance, and identity. The festival ensured that the lessons of Esther would remain active, rather than becoming forgotten historical details. In this way, Mordecai's influence extended beyond his own lifetime and entered the ongoing life of the community itself. The legacy of Mordecai also extends into the world of scholarship. As we explored in the previous chapter, historians continue to debate aspects of the Book of Esther and the extent to which various details can be independently verified. Literary scholars analyze the structure of the narrative. Theologians examine its treatment of providence and human responsibility. Historians investigate its Persian context. Few biblical figures occupy such an interesting intersection of disciplines. Mordecai remains relevant not only because of what he may have done in the past, but because his story continues to generate meaningful questions in the present. Discussions about minority identity, political power, cultural preservation, leadership under pressure, and the relationship between faith and uncertainty all find expression within the narrative associated with his name. Yet perhaps the most enduring aspect of Mordecai's legacy is the way his story challenges common assumptions about significance. When we first encountered him, he appeared to be an ordinary member of a diaspora community. Nothing about his introduction suggested that he would eventually become one of the most influential figures in the narrative. He was neither the king nor the queen. He was not the most powerful person in the empire. His importance emerged gradually through a series of decisions. He accepted responsibility for Esther. He remained attentive to events around him. He responded when danger appeared. He encouraged courage when hesitation seemed safer. Step by step, his influence expanded because he consistently acted upon the responsibilities placed before him. The story suggests that historical significance often develops in precisely this way. Extraordinary impact is frequently built upon ordinary acts of faithfulness performed over time. This observation may be the deepest lesson Mordecai leaves behind. His life demonstrates that influence is not determined solely by position, wealth, or status. It is shaped by character, responsibility, and the willingness to act when circumstances demand action. Whether viewed through the lens of scripture, history, literature, or leadership, Mordecai remains a remarkably relevant figure. He represents the challenges of maintaining identity in a changing world. He illustrates the complexity of leadership under pressure. He shows how individual choices can affect entire communities. Most importantly, he reminds readers that history is often shaped by people who begin with no expectation of becoming significant at all. Long after the Persian Empire disappeared, long after the Palace of Susa became a subject for archaeologists rather than officials, the story of Mordecai continued to be told. That enduring memory may be the strongest evidence of his legacy. He began as a guardian living on the margins of empire. He ended as a figure whose influence outlived the empire itself. And that is why the story of Mordecai continues to be remembered today.